My name is Evan, and this happened 3 winters ago in northern Alberta, where towns disappear under snow and you can drive for hours without seeing another human being. I lived alone back then, in a small rental cabin near the tree line. Cheap, isolated, perfect for the quiet life I thought I wanted. That night, the wind was vicious. It clawed at the windows and pushed snow against the doors so hard I could hear the frame whining. I was editing photos from a wildlife shoot when I heard the first knock. Soft, single, almost polite. I froze. No one ever came out here. Not at night, not during a storm. I waited. Maybe it was a branch, maybe the wind, maybe my imagination after hours in silence. Then the second knock came. This time harder, measured, intentional. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I remember standing and walking toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. I didn't open it. I just leaned in, listening. No voice, no footsteps, no breathing, just a presence, like someone was waiting patiently on the other side. Then something happened that made my skin crawl. The doorknob twitched, not a full turn, just a tiny, testing movement, as if someone wanted to see how easily it would give. And I knew whoever was out there wasn't lost. They were trying to get in. I didn't open the door. Instead, I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on that trembling doorknob as the storm howled outside. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, like the walls were leaning inward. I grabbed my phone instinctively. No signal, of course. Storms this far north always killed reception. For a moment, the knocking stopped. No sound, no movement, just the wind roaring like something alive. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate crunches in the snow, circling the cabin. Whoever it was didn't call out, didn't ask for help, didn't explain why they were out here at nearly midnight. They just walked. I turned off every light except the kitchen lamp and crouched near the window, careful not to expose my silhouette. Through the frost-covered glass, I could only see vague shapes of trees and blowing snow. But the footsteps kept moving, pacing around the cabin in a wide arc, almost like the person was inspecting it. When the footsteps finally stopped, they stopped directly beneath the kitchen window. My breath hitched. A faint tapping, knuckles brushing the glass, echoed softly through the room. This wasn't a knock. It was closer to a greeting, like someone letting me know they had found me. And then, spoken through the storm, barely audible, "I know you're awake." My blood turned to ice. Whoever this was wasn't lost. They had come here for me. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to stay hidden, to keep silent, to pretend the cabin was empty. The figure outside didn't knock again. He just stood there, breathing softly against the glass. I could see the faint fog of his breath trailing down the frost. Then, slowly, his hand slid down the window. Long fingers, pale skin, too still. Something about the movement felt wrong, like it wasn't quite human, or wasn't quite comfortable being human. I quietly backed away from the window and reached for the shotgun mounted above the fireplace. It was old, left by the previous tenant, and I'd never fired it. But right now, it was the only thing grounding me from panic. After what felt like minutes, the footsteps resumed, this time heading toward the front porch. Each thud in the snow sounded heavier than before, as if the person was dragging something or growing tired. Then came the third knock. Not soft, not polite. A slow, eerily confident knock, like someone announcing themselves at a friend's house. I stood behind the couch, shotgun trembling in my hands. "Who's there?" I finally shouted, voice cracking. No response. Instead, something slid under the door. A thin, wet sheet of paper, smeared with something dark. I didn't pick it up. I just stared as the storm wind pressed it against the wooden floor. The man outside whispered again. "You forgot this." I stared at the stained paper on the floor, tempted and terrified at the same time. My fingers twitched around the shotgun as the wind moaned against the cabin walls. Snowflakes pushed through the doorframe cracks, drifting around the edges like cold dust. I didn't want to touch the paper, but something about the man's whisper, "You forgot this," was gnawing at me. What could he possibly think I'd dropped? I'd never seen him before in my life. Outside, the footsteps moved again, slow, deliberate, heavy. He wasn't leaving. He was pacing, waiting, listening. Finally, I nudged the paper closer with the shotgun barrel. When it flipped over, my breath froze in my chest. It was a photograph of me, taken from outside the cabin, taken tonight. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the gun. My mind raced. How long had he been out there? How long had he been watching my cabin through the dark? Then I heard him lean close to the door. His voice, low and steady, seeped through the wood. "You shouldn't live alone, Evan." My full name, spoken by a stranger in the middle of a blizzard. I felt the cabin tilt around me. He knew who I was. He had been watching me long before tonight. And then came the most terrifying sound yet. Not a knock, not a whisper. The front door latch lifted. Someone was trying to open it from the outside. The latch rattled once. Soft, testing. Then again, harder this time, as if the man outside was becoming impatient. I pointed the shotgun toward the door, my shaking hands barely keeping the barrel steady. "If you open that," I shouted, "I swear I'll shoot." The wind swallowed my voice, carrying it into the storm. The man outside went silent, and for a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, he had backed away. Then I heard him chuckle, a slow, exhausted, almost disappointed laugh. It didn't sound threatening, it sounded sad. Like he already knew something I didn't. The latch stopped moving. The footsteps began again, but not away from the cabin. No. They moved toward the window, the one near the couch. Heavy boots crunching through knee-deep snow. I ducked behind the furniture, gripping the shotgun so tightly my knuckles ached. When the footsteps stopped, the window pane dimmed. Someone was blocking the outside light. I dared a glance, a face pressed against the frost, but not normally. It was tilted, jaw slack, eyes unfocused, skin gray and sagging slightly, like a mask thawing in the cold. And the lips, if they were lips, moved slowly. "Let me in. I'm freezing." A loud crack echoed through the cabin. The window frame splintered under pressure. He wasn't trying to knock anymore. He was trying to push his way in. And I finally realized this wasn't a normal man. Whatever was outside wasn't supposed to be alive. The window frame groaned as the thing outside pressed harder, its frozen skin leaving greasy smears across the glass. I backed away, heart slamming against my ribs. Every instinct screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. The nearest town was 40 minutes of untouched forest and blizzard away. If I stepped outside, I'd freeze or meet him face to face. The cracking grew louder. Tiny fractures spiderwebbed across the window pane. The creature tilted its head, studying me through the glass like I was something it was trying to remember or mimic. "I'm cold," it whispered again. But this time the voice sounded stretched, as if the words were being pulled apart while leaving its throat. I aimed the shotgun at the window. "Stay back," I yelled, though my voice barely rose above the storm. The glass flexed inward. Then, Boom! A branch slammed into the other side of the cabin, shaking the whole structure. I flinched and spun around, thinking there was a second intruder. In that instant, the window gave way. But the thing didn't climb in. Instead, it froze mid-motion, as if listening to something deeper within the storm. Its head twitched violently toward the tree line, and for a moment, I saw pure fear in its dead eyes. Then it backed away slowly, never turning around, never blinking. Footsteps faded into the blizzard. Whatever it wasn't alone out there. I didn't dare move for several minutes. My breath came in sharp, uneven bursts as I stared at the broken window, waiting for the creature's face to reappear. The storm hissed through the shattered frame, filling the cabin with icy air. Snowflakes drifted inside like ash from some unseen fire. When I finally forced my legs to move, I dragged a dresser against the window. It rattled violently as the wind slammed against it, but at least it made me feel like I had some control. I checked the rest of the cabin, every door, every window. Everything was locked. Everything was intact except that one shattered pane. But something felt wrong. The photograph on the floor. I hadn't touched it since earlier. But now it wasn't lying flat. It stood, propped upright, leaning against the door as if someone had placed it there deliberately. And the photo had changed. It was still me. Still the cabin. Still taken from outside tonight. But now, there was a second figure standing behind me in the frame. Tall, dark, long-limbed, a shape I hadn't seen before. My throat tightened. I spun around, expecting something to be standing behind me. Nothing was there. Only the faint whistle of cold air and the creaking of wood under the storm's weight. Then, underneath the dresser blocking the window, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Like fingers drumming slowly, patiently, waiting to be let in again. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, dragging sound along the outer wall. It moved around the cabin slowly, almost curiously, as if the creature was feeling along the wooden planks. I held the shotgun tightly, tracking the sound with my steps, my breath fogging in the cold air. Then, something new. A second sound. Lighter, faster, different footsteps. There was more than one now. I pressed my ear against the front door despite every instinct screaming not to. The wind howled violently, but beneath it, I heard them whispering. Not words, not language. Breathing, multiple breaths, uneven and raspy, crowding near the porch. Suddenly, a loud thud hit the door, strong enough to shake snow loose from the roof. I stumbled back as another impact followed, then another. They weren't knocking anymore. They were testing the wood, pressing their weight against it. My phone screen lit up. One bar of signal. Shaking, I dialed the RCMP. The call rang once before cutting off. The signal disappeared completely. I looked back at the door, heart pounding. Snow blew inward through the cracks around the frame. Something slid past the gap. A fingertip. Gray, elongated, dragging slowly along the inside edge as if feeling for a weakness. I couldn't stay here. If they pushed hard enough, the door wouldn't hold. I had to escape, into the blizzard, or die inside. My only chance was the back door, the one facing the deeper forest. It was risky, but the creatures were focused on the front and window. I grabbed my coat, pulled on my boots with shaking hands, and slung the shotgun over my shoulder. The back door opened into absolute darkness. The storm had swallowed everything. Snow whipped into my face the moment I stepped outside, stinging like shards of glass. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet. I forced myself forward, away from the porch light, into the trees. Branches bent violently overhead, cracking like bones. The forest was a maze of shadows and whiteout conditions. Behind me, the cabin door splintered. A chorus of shrieks, too human and not human at all, ripped through the night. They'd gotten in. I pushed deeper, stumbling through knee-high snow. My breath burned, my lungs tight from the cold. Every few seconds, I glanced back. Through the storm, faint figures spilled out of the cabin. Slender silhouettes moving with unnatural jerks, searching. One of them lifted its head and screamed. Not a warning, not a cry, a hunting call. Dozens of answering shrieks echoed through the forest, farther away, maybe miles away, yet still too close. They weren't just around my cabin. They were everywhere in these woods, and they were coming for me. I ran blindly through the storm, the creatures' shrieks bouncing off the trees, impossible to pinpoint. Every second felt like they were right behind me. My legs burned, my fingers were going numb, my breath came in violent gasps. I didn't know where I was going, just deeper into the forest, away from them. Then, through the storm, I saw it. A faint orange glow, a fire. I stumbled toward it, heart pounding with desperate hope. As I pushed through the final wall of branches, I found a small clearing, and a man sitting beside a roaring campfire, wrapped in heavy gear. He looked up, startled. Before I could speak, he stood. "You shouldn't be out here," he shouted over the wind. "Something's moving in the trees." "I know," I gasped. "They're following me." He grabbed my arm and dragged me close to the fire. "Stay near the heat. They hate it." The shrieks grew louder, circling the clearing. Shapes moved between the trees, pacing just beyond the firelight. Dozens of them. One stepped forward, long limbs folding unnaturally as it crouched. Its dead eyes reflected the flames. But it wouldn't enter. None of them would. They watched us for hours, silent now, studying, waiting for the fire to die. By morning, the storm had calmed. The creatures were gone, but their footprints, hundreds of them, surrounded the clearing like a ritual circle. I never went back to my cabin, and on quiet winter nights, I still hear knocking, soft, polite, twice. My name is Jordan Whitfield, and this happened during the winter I took a solo trip to northern British Columbia, something I thought would help clear my mind after a brutal breakup. I rented a small off-grid cabin deep in the woods near Takla Landing. The owner, an old Cree man named Akeem, warned me about winter travel and things that walk without leaving sign, but I assumed he meant wildlife or old folklore. At that point, I wasn't in the mood for stories. I just wanted silence. The cabin was isolated, the kind of place where you couldn't hear anything except your own heartbeat. Snow was piled waist-high around the deck, untouched and perfectly smooth. I checked the perimeter just out of habit, expecting tracks from deer or maybe wolves. But there was nothing, not a single mark. It was as if no living thing had moved through the area in years. Inside, the cabin smelled like cedar and cold air. A single lantern illuminated the small room, casting long shadows across the floorboards. I made a fire, set my bags down, and tried to relax. The isolation felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. Around midnight, I heard something lightly brush against the outside wall. I froze, not because of the sound, but because I knew what fresh snow sounded like. A crunch, a shift, a compressing weight. But outside, there was nothing stepping on the snow at all. At first, I convinced myself it was something falling off the roof. Snow slipping, branches shifting, But the sound came again, this time from the corner of the cabin. A slow, dragging brush, like fingertips trailing along wood. I crept toward the nearest window, wiping away frost with my sleeve. Nothing. Just empty snow and a dark tree line. I stepped outside with my flashlight, half expecting to find an animal circling the cabin. My breath billowed into the freezing air as I scanned the ground. Still no tracks. But something had definitely moved. The snow near the corner of the cabin had a slight depression. Subtle, almost invisible, like something had pressed against it from the air instead of standing on it. I knelt closer, my pulse thumping in my ears. The depression wasn't from footsteps. It was more like the snow had been pushed outward, bulging in a strange pattern, the way fabric distorts when a hand presses against it from behind. A sudden gust of icy wind swept across the clearing, forcing me to straighten up. The trees around the cabin swayed lightly, but there was no storm, no breeze strong enough to explain the movement. That's when I heard it, a whisper. So faint it sounded like someone speaking through thick cloth. It came from behind the cabin, just out of sight, and it said my name. I stumbled back, slipping on the ice as the whisper repeated, clearer this time, shaped by a voice that didn't sound human. It was too thin, stretched, as if the sound was coming from the wrong place, curling around me instead of traveling through the air. I forced myself to walk toward the back of the cabin, each step deliberate, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam swept over the snow, still untouched, still impossibly smooth. Nothing living could move here without leaving a sign. Nothing. And yet, something was circling me. I heard the whisper again, this time from the right, then instantly from the left. The sound kept relocating faster than anything should be able to move. My chest tightened as I turned in a slow circle, watching for any hint of movement. The tree line seemed darker than before, the shadows stretched into impossible angles. For a moment, I thought I saw a silhouette standing between two pines, tall, thin, almost blending into the bark. But when I blinked, it was gone. A sudden thud against the cabin wall made me jump. I rushed around the corner and froze. The wooden planks were covered in long, parallel streaks. Fresh and icy steam drifted off them, as if something extremely cold had touched the surface. But there were still no tracks. No drag marks. No disturbed snow of any kind. Something out here was moving freely. Without ever touching the ground, I went back inside, bolting the door behind me. The temperature had dropped sharply in just minutes. The windows were fogging from the inside, frost thickening along the edges. I threw more logs into the fire, but even the flames seemed dimmer, like something was leaching the warmth from the room. My hand shook as I reached for my satellite phone to call the cabin owner. Before I could dial, something tapped the window. Once, twice, 3 slow taps. I stared at the frosted glass. There was a shape on the other side, tall, unmoving. I couldn't make out its features. Just a narrow form pressed so close that frost began spidering across the window in branching patterns. Then, a sound vibrated through the wall. Not a whisper this time. Breathing. Long, hollow breaths that didn't fog the glass, didn't rise or fall. Just a steady, unnatural rhythm. I backed away slowly until my calves hit the bed frame. The breathing stopped. The tapping stopped. The frost on the window melted instantly, dripping down like tears. And then, a soft voice, much too close, spoke from behind me. "Why did you come here alone, Jordan?" I spun around, heart pounding, expecting to find the cabin invaded. But the room was empty. The fire crackled weakly, and the shadows felt thicker than they should be. I aimed my flashlight at every corner of the cabin, expecting something to leap out of the darkness. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. Yet I could still feel the presence, like cold fingers hovering just above my skin. I grabbed my boots and jacket, deciding I couldn't stay here another minute. As I reached the door, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Near the bottom of the cabin wall, a set of marks had appeared. Deep, curved grooves, as if something had dragged its nails across the wood from the inside. I hadn't heard it. I hadn't seen it happen. I yanked the door open. Snow blew in, cold and dry. The clearing was silent again. Too silent. I stepped outside, planning to make a straight path toward the main logging road. As I took my third step, I noticed something that froze me in place. There were footprints now, but they weren't mine. A single line of them stretched from the tree line straight to the cabin door. Steps placed evenly, perfectly, too close together for a human stride. The prints were deep, sharp-edged, and narrow, almost like someone had been walking on the very tips of their toes. I followed them backward with my flashlight. They stopped abruptly at the edge of the forest. Not faded, not scattered. Stopped, cleanly, as if the figure had simply appeared there out of thin air. I don't know why I followed those footprints. Fear should have pushed me in the opposite direction, but my mind locked onto a single, disturbing thought. Whatever made those prints had been close enough to whisper my name. I needed to know how far it had gone. I walked toward the trees slowly, flashlight trembling in my hand. The forest was a wall of black silhouettes, each trunk merging with the next. The footprints ended exactly at the line where the shadows began. Like the creature refused to cross back into the trees, or maybe it couldn't. As I got closer, the temperature dropped again. My breath thickened into solid plumes, and a thin layer of frost formed across my jacket. The trees seemed unnaturally still. Even the wind had stopped. It felt like stepping into a vacuum, soundless, airless. Then I noticed something behind the last footprint. Not a track, not a marking. A shape. A dark, slender outline pressed flush against a pine tree. So thin, it looked like a shadow that had peeled itself away from the trunk. The flashlight beam flickered when it touched it, as though the figure absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. I blinked, and it was suddenly 2 feet closer. Another blink, and it was gone. The forest around me exhaled all at once, branches shaking violently as if something massive had moved through them without touching the ground. I backed away toward the cabin, heart hammering. Whatever was watching me wasn't bound by the rules of anything I understood. Back inside the cabin, I barricaded the door with a table and dragged the bed frame against the window. My hands were numb, not from the cold, but from shaking so violently I could barely grip anything. The firewood crackled as it burned, but despite the flames, the cabin felt colder than outside. I sat on the floor, clutching the flashlight, trying to steady my breathing. I kept replaying what I saw, how the shape had moved, how the footprints appeared without a single step taken. My mind kept searching for logic, some natural explanation. But every possibility collapsed under the weight of what I'd witnessed. A sudden groan echoed through the room. At first, I thought it came from the roof, snow shifting or timber settling. But then it repeated, lower this time, resonating through the floorboards. Something was underneath the cabin. The groan turned into scraping, a rhythmic dragging noise, like fingertips tracing the belly of the floor. The boards vibrated under my legs, and the lantern flickered violently. I backed up against the wall as the scraping moved toward the center of the cabin, then stopped directly beneath me. Silence. Then, a whisper came through the floorboards, muffled but unmistakable. "You still don't see me, Jordan." My blood turned to ice. Slowly, the wood beneath me bulged upward, as if something was pushing its way through from below. I scrambled away as the bulge in the floor rose higher, the wood bending but not breaking. Like the pressure came from something that didn't rely on strength, but presence. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed my phone and essentials inside, and made a desperate decision. I wasn't staying another second. I burst through the door into the frigid air. The sky was a deep indigo, stars barely visible behind streaks of cloud. The snow sparkled under my flashlight, undisturbed except for... My breath caught. A new line of footprints had appeared, not leading toward the cabin this time, but circling it. Perfectly spaced, perfectly straight, as if something had walked around the cabin in a continuous loop, faster than I could comprehend. The entire perimeter was ringed with those narrow, inhuman steps. I began trudging through the snow toward the logging road, trying not to look behind me. But after 50 feet, a sound made me turn. All the footprints, the entire ring, were now pointing inward, toward the cabin, toward me. My legs nearly gave out. The tree line ahead rustled with movement, though no tracks led into it. Branches swayed, but there was no wind. The darkness between the trunks thickened, coiling like smoke. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to walk this time. I forced myself forward, heart slamming against my ribs. Every instinct screamed that I was being hunted. I kept moving, pushing through snow that came up to my knees. My lungs burned, each breath turning to ice. The logging road was still far ahead, nothing but a faint memory of a path buried beneath the snow. Behind me, the forest crackled. Sharp, fast, unnatural. Not footsteps, not an animal. More like something slicing through the air, tearing at it. The shadows around the cabin collapsed inward, like hands withdrawing. Then a new sound rose, a deep, vibrating hum, so low it rattled my teeth. It felt like the entire forest was resonating with it. I turned my head for a split second. A shape was rushing toward me across the snow. Not walking, not running, gliding. It moved without disturbing the surface, its body elongating and folding as it crossed the distance. Its face was indistinct, just a pale smear, as if features were painted over with frost. I screamed and pushed myself harder. The hum grew louder, building pressure behind my ears. Suddenly, the creature halted 10 feet away, tilting its head. The hum stopped. Then it spoke, not through a mouth, through the air. "Don't go back to the lights, Jordan." The tree line ahead flickered, lanterns or headlights, or something bright and inviting. But something in the creature's voice twisted the warning into a threat, as if leaving the darkness was exactly what it didn't want me to do. I didn't listen. I ran harder. The lights ahead grew brighter, warm, golden, human. That's what I told myself as I stumbled toward them. My vision blurred from cold and panic. Every few steps, I risked a glance behind me, expecting the creature to be inches away. It wasn't, but its voice followed me, carried by the air itself. "You won't like what you find." I ignored it and pushed on until the snow suddenly gave way to a cleared patch of land. The lights weren't headlights. They weren't cabin lanterns. They were floodlights mounted on a small forestry outpost, one I had passed on my way in. Relief washed through me so hard, I collapsed to my knees. A man in a parka rushed out, shouting something I couldn't hear. He grabbed my arm and dragged me inside the outpost building, slamming the door shut behind us. "Where did you come from?" he asked, shaking my shoulders. "No one's lived in that cabin for years. It collapsed last spring." I stared at him, numb. "That's not possible," I whispered. "I was just there." The man exchanged a grim look with another ranger. "You're the third person this year who said that." Outside, the hum returned, distant, hungry. The ranger lowered the blinds. "Whatever's in those woods, it likes lonely people." I never went back to retrieve my things. I never went back to British Columbia at all. My name is Alex Tremblay, and this happened to me when I was working as a conductor on a small regional train line in northern Quebec. I had been assigned the 11:15 p.m. run, the last train leaving Chibougamau toward misty remote settlements. Winters up north are merciless, and I was no stranger to blizzards and darkness. But what I encountered that night was unlike anything I had ever imagined. The passengers were few, mostly locals returning from visiting relatives. I walked the narrow aisle, checking tickets, smiling at familiar faces. When I reached the middle car, I noticed something strange. An elderly woman was seated alone, her face buried in a thick scarf. Her hands were ice cold despite the heating, and her eyes, when she finally looked at me, were hollow, empty, like a well someone had stared into too long. I asked if she needed anything. She whispered my name, not in a greeting, in warning. I froze. "Don't look outside," she said. "It waits for travelers who wander into the night." I laughed nervously, dismissing it as old superstition. But something about the way the train groaned on the tracks, the metallic screeching, the cold wind rushing through gaps in the windows, made me uneasy. I shook it off and moved to the next car. Minutes later, the train passed a familiar bridge over a frozen river, and I noticed something impossible. Another train on the parallel track. It was moving backward, and there were no lights in it. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the train outside. It moved in silence, smooth and fast. But something was off. It seemed heavier, almost sinking into the frozen landscape. No smoke, no headlamp. Just a black silhouette gliding on the tracks beside ours. I called out to the elderly woman, but she had vanished. I ran toward the next car, checking every seat. Nobody. Just empty seats. Frost forming on the corners of the windows, the sound of the train's wheels on the rails distorted and hollow. The passengers had all fallen asleep, or at least pretended to. I tried to radio the engineer, but the intercom was dead. Not malfunctioning, completely silent, like the wires themselves had been erased. I leaned against the window, staring at the phantom train. Then I noticed figures in the windows, as shadows. At first, I thought it was a trick of the reflection, but they moved independently, shifting closer to the edges of the car as if searching for something, someone. Suddenly, one of the figures raised its hand. A finger pointed directly at our train. The movement was deliberate, jerky, unnatural. My stomach dropped. Then, without warning, the phantom train vanished. Not around a bend, not into the shadows. Gone, as if it had never existed. The wind picked up, rattling the train. My heart hammered. Something was coming. The next hour passed in a blur of frozen panic. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching the train, inside, outside, everywhere. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of shadowy figures moving along the tracks beside us. But when I blinked, they disappeared. The train itself seemed heavier, groaning under invisible pressure. Then, the lights flickered. Not the cabin lights. Outside. The world beyond the train windows glowed dimly, almost like a fog of orange fire, stretching across the snow-covered trees. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced by the deep, suffocating darkness. I noticed one passenger stirring, a man who had been asleep since the start of the ride. He turned his head slowly, and his face was pale, his eyes wide, frozen in terror. "Do you see them?" he whispered. "They're on the tracks, waiting for us to slow down." I tried to reassure him, tried to convince myself that we were safe. But I knew the train was no longer bound by any ordinary path. Something unnatural was guiding it tonight. My fingers gripped the railing as the train rattled more violently than before. The whistle blew, a low, mournful note that didn't sound mechanical. It echoed through the frozen wilderness, twisting in impossible directions, as though calling to something out there. And then the train jolted sharply, as if it had jumped tracks. The sudden jolt threw me against a seat. Everyone gasped. Some passengers clutched the rails, others simply stared into the darkness, wide-eyed. I ran to the engineer's cabin, but the door wouldn't budge. Locked, not electronically, not mechanically, locked by something else. I pounded on it with my fists, but the interior remained silent. No response, just the low moan of the rails beneath us. Through the window of the cabin, I saw a flicker of movement. Another train? Something resembling the first one? But this time it was closer, almost impossibly close, hovering above the tracks for a moment before darting into the shadows. A deep, metallic hum filled the air, vibrating through the train and into my bones. The passengers began murmuring in panic, voices trembling. I noticed a young girl clutching a stuffed animal. She wasn't moving. She was staring straight ahead, lips forming words I couldn't hear, her eyes blank. Then the lights of our own train flickered and went out entirely, pitch black inside. The whistle howled again, longer this time, as if screaming in defiance or warning. The shadows from outside seemed to enter the cars, stretching along walls and floor, brushing against the passenger's skin without touching. I could feel it crawling toward me. Something alive, patient and ancient. In the darkness, I fumbled for my flashlight. When I finally switched it on, the beam revealed an impossible sight. The passengers weren't asleep. They weren't even human anymore. Their faces were stretched and hollow, eyes black voids reflecting nothing. They turned toward me as one, tilting their heads in unison. I stumbled backward, nearly falling, tripping over the floor latch. From the window, I saw the second train again, hovering above the tracks, its outline massive and indistinct. Figures moved atop it, tall, thin, spectral shapes, shifting as if the wind itself carried them. Their eyes glowed faintly, white and empty. One of them pointed toward our train. A low, vibrating hum returned, merging with whispers from the passengers around me. They weren't speaking. The sound came from the air itself. It twisted around me, pulling at my mind, tugging at memories I didn't want to remember. I ran down the aisle toward the back, but the train felt endless, longer than it had ever been. Each door I opened revealed another identical car, more hollow passengers, more shadowy figures outside. The train seemed to multiply around me, stretching into infinity. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the lights returned. The passengers were normal again, or at least appeared so. They murmured softly, confused, as though waking from a dream. But the tracks outside were gone. Just snow. Endless snow. And somewhere in the distance, I heard that hum again. Patient, waiting, eternal. After that night, I couldn't sleep for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hovering train, the spectral figures, the hollow passengers staring at me in silence. I kept questioning what I had witnessed, trying to rationalize it as exhaustion or some northern hallucination caused by the cold and isolation. But when I returned to the train depot the following morning, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. Every schedule board for the 11:15 p.m. train had been erased. Even the historical records showed a gap, no run recorded for the night I had worked. I spoke to the chief engineer, hoping to find confirmation that it was just a glitch or some mistake, but he shook his head. "No one has worked that route recently," he said. "It's been closed for maintenance." I tried to convince myself it was a one-time anomaly. Maybe I had been dreaming. But as I left the depot, I saw footprints in the snow outside, a single line leading into the dark forest beside the tracks. They were narrow, unnaturally spaced, and ended abruptly, just like the ones I had glimpsed on the phantom train. The hum returned, faint and distant, but unmistakable. I spun around, but the forest was empty, or so it seemed. Something waits out there, something ancient, patient, and relentless. And it knows when travelers are alone at night. Weeks later, I returned to the north for another assignment, thinking I could avoid the 11:15 p.m. route entirely. But fate, or whatever lingers in that frozen wilderness, had other plans. One of my colleagues disappeared during a night shift. The last transmission from her radio was just a whisper, repeating her own name over and over. I tried to investigate discreetly, fearing disbelief from the higher-ups. I went back to the abandoned tracks, retracing the path I had taken the night of my encounter. The snow was freshly fallen, pristine, except for a single set of footprints leading straight into the forest, deeper than any human could traverse. I followed them, heart pounding, flashlight slicing through dense shadows. The forest seemed to close around me, branches curling like fingers. The hum started again, low and pulsing, vibrating through my chest. And then, in the distance, the lights appeared. Not normal train lights, but the same eerie glow I had seen on that phantom train. I froze. The figures were there again. Tall, elongated silhouettes moving atop a train that wasn't supposed to exist. They stared down at me with hollow eyes that reflected nothing, beckoning silently. I backed away, my legs trembling, knowing that any step closer could mean being swallowed by the unknown. I ran blindly through the snow, branches whipping my face, the hum growing louder, vibrating through my very bones. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, alive, intelligent, and patient. Every time I thought I had gained distance, the forest seemed to stretch, pulling me back toward the phantom train. I tripped, falling face first into the snow. The hum surged. I looked up and saw them, dozens of shadowed figures, standing atop the trees now, tall, impossibly thin, gliding without touching branches. They moved in unison, silent, patient, watching. I scrambled to my feet, my breath ragged, and forced myself toward the faint glow of a distant logging outpost. The path seemed longer than I remembered, twisted in ways that defied reality. Snow seemed deeper, heavier, slowing my steps as if the forest itself was conspiring against me. Every time I turned, the shadows multiplied. I swear I saw one of the figures inside my flashlight's beam moving along the ground as if crawling through the snow, only to vanish when I blinked. By the time I reached the outpost, I was shaking uncontrollably. The rangers looked at me like I was insane as I pointed frantically toward the tracks, trying to explain what I had seen. And then I noticed. The tracks themselves were gone. buried beneath a layer of untouched snow, as if the train had never existed. Inside the outpost, I collapsed, shivering. The rangers offered blankets, warm tea, words of comfort I could barely hear. My mind kept replaying the impossible. The phantom train, the hollow passengers, the figures atop the tracks. It all felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Then one of the rangers showed me a journal, a record kept by previous conductors. Page after page contained entries about ghost trains, vanished passengers, unexplained lights, and the same humming sound. Each incident ended with a warning. Never ride the Northern Line at night. Never travel alone. I felt a chill in my spine. This wasn't just folklore. It was history. Real, repeated, documented history. And I had been one of its newest witnesses. The hum returned faintly outside, carried on the wind. I ran to the window. The snow was still. The tracks empty. Yet, just beyond the tree line, I could see a faint glow, as if someone or something was watching, waiting, measuring. I understood then that the northern wilderness had rules beyond human comprehension. Travelers who enter at night alone are never truly free. They are observed, judged, and sometimes collected. I never worked the night route again, and I never will. Years later, I still dream of that night. Sometimes I wake to the same low hum, vibrating through my bedroom as if it followed me south, beyond the frozen wilderness. I've tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, a stress-induced nightmare. But I know better. Every winter, I hear about a missing traveler on the Northern Rail line. Every year, the same pattern. Last train, 11:15 p.m. Vanished passengers, eerie lights, unexplained tracks appearing and disappearing. I still live with the fear that one day, that hum will find me again. That the figures will return, patient and relentless, to finish what they began. And sometimes, when the wind carries through my windows, I hear a faint whisper. Do you see them now, Alex? I never want to know the answer. But I also know that if I ever ride those tracks again, there will be no return. The Northern Line of Quebec is not a place for the living after dark. It belongs to something else entirely. I escaped, barely. But some nights, I wonder if it will let me go a second time. My name is Claire Donovan, and this happened during a winter expedition in the Yukon. I had joined a small research team studying glacial patterns, and our base was an isolated cabin deep in the wilderness. The night air was crisp, the moonlight reflecting off endless sheets of snow, painting the landscape in silver and shadow. It was beautiful, terrifying, and absolute in its silence. The first night in the cabin felt normal enough. We lit the wood stove, shared a simple meal, and talked quietly about the expedition's plans. But around midnight, I noticed something odd. A single set of footprints led away from the cabin, out into the snow, disappearing into the trees. None of us had gone outside. I mentioned it casually to my colleague, Mark, who shrugged. Maybe an animal, he said. Could be a fox or coyote. But the prints were too deep, too deliberate. They weren't made by paws, they were human. Curiosity gnawed at me. I glanced out the frosted window, scanning the darkness. The footprints didn't return. They stopped abruptly as though the person had vanished. I should have let it go, gone back to bed. But something about those prints felt wrong, unnatural. That night, I couldn't sleep. Listening to the wind rattle the cabin and whisper through the trees as though carrying a secret meant only for me. My name is Claire Donovan, and this happened during a winter expedition in the Yukon. I had joined a small research team studying glacial patterns, and our base was an isolated cabin deep in the wilderness. The night air was crisp, the moonlight reflecting off endless sheets of snow, painting the landscape in silver and shadow. It was beautiful, terrifying, and absolute in its silence. The first night in the cabin felt normal enough. We lit the wood stove, shared a simple meal, and talked quietly about the expedition's plans. But around midnight, I noticed something odd. A single set of footprints led away from the cabin, out into the snow, disappearing into the trees. None of us had gone outside. I mentioned it casually to my colleague, Mark, who shrugged. "Maybe an animal," he said. "Could be a fox or coyote." But the prints were too deep, too deliberate. They weren't made by paws, they were human. Curiosity gnawed at me. I glanced out the frosted window, scanning the darkness. The footprints didn't return. They stopped abruptly, as though the person had vanished. I should have let it go, gone back to bed. But something about those prints felt wrong, unnatural. That night, I couldn't sleep. Listening to the wind rattle the cabin and whisper through the trees, as though carrying a secret, meant only for me, I woke to a noise. Scraping, deliberate, from the roof. My heart raced. The others were asleep. I crept to the window and saw nothing but endless snow and dark pines. Yet the sound continued, moving along the roof as if someone was walking above us. I whispered to Mark, who stirred but said nothing. Then I saw it. A figure crouched near the edge of the cabin, pale in the moonlight, moving impossibly fast. I blinked, and it was gone. I tried to rationalize it. Exhaustion, stress, the isolation. But the footprints told a different story. New prints appeared overnight, leading not just to the cabin, but forming a circle around it, stopping at precise intervals. That evening, the wind dropped. Complete silence. The forest pressed against the windows, a living black wall. Then came the knock, a faint, slow, measured rapping at the door. One knock. Pause. Two knocks. I froze. I opened the door slowly. Nothing. Only snow. But the footprints continued beyond the doorway, deeper into the forest, then vanished. I turned back to the cabin, and the wind whispered something in my ear. I couldn't understand the words, but the intent was clear. You are being watched. By the fourth night, fear had settled into our bones. Sleep was impossible. Every creak, every gust of wind, every small sound outside the cabin made us flinch. I stayed near the fire, flashlight clutched tightly, trying to feel safe. Then I noticed movement in the cabin. Shadows shifting across the walls, but no one moved. I called out. Silence. Only the wind answered. But it wasn't the wind. Something had entered. Mark insisted we stay calm. It's probably an animal or hallucinations. I wanted to believe him, but the air itself felt heavy, charged, like electricity before a storm. And then came the smell. Cold metal, rust, iron. Something had been inside. Something had walked among us. Outside, the footprints had changed. They were no longer human-sized. They were longer, narrower, impossible. They circled the cabin, disappeared, and reappeared in impossible locations, as if bending the space around them. Suddenly, I heard whispers, faint and sibilant. I froze, straining to hear. My own name, my full name, repeated over and over, carried by the wind. I stepped outside despite the cold, the flashlight trembling. The forest was silent, but I could feel the eyes on me. Then, a hand, pale, thin, impossibly long, grasped the window from the outside. I stumbled backward, heart hammering. something wanted inside. We decided to leave, all of us. Grab our gear, hike to the nearest ranger station before sunrise. I packed furiously while Mark and the others tried to stay rational, but panic was everywhere. Stepping outside, the forest was alive. Snow swirled unnaturally, trees creaking as though whispering secrets. The footprints, always following us, were already ahead, leading in patterns we didn't understand. Halfway through the hike, the wind stopped. Silence so complete it hurt my ears. And then, from the shadows between the pines, I saw movement. Dozens of figures, humanoid but impossibly thin, gliding along the snow without leaving tracks. Their eyes glowed faintly white, fixed on us. The forest seemed to close around us. Every step we took felt slower, heavier, as if the air itself resisted our progress. I could hear whispers, now intelligible, murmuring our names, urging us back toward the cabin. The closest figure raised a hand, and the snow around it began to warp. It rippled unnaturally, distorting space. I stumbled, nearly falling. We ran, guided only by the faint light of a distant ridge. Behind us, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of sound that seemed to echo from every direction. I realized then. Whatever hunted us wasn't just a presence in the snow. It controlled it. And it didn't intend to let us leave alive. By the time we reached the ridge, exhaustion had nearly claimed us. The snow crunched under our boots, every step an effort, every breath visible in the icy air. Behind us, the forest remained silent. Too silent. I feared the pause meant the figures were preparing something far worse. Mark stopped abruptly. "Look," he whispered, pointing to the ground. The footprints weren't ours. They were larger, longer, twisting unnaturally through the snow as if weaving a trap. They led back to the cabin, but also in circles around us, impossible geometry that shouldn't exist in the natural world. A low hum began, vibrating through my chest, growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't wind. It was alive, resonating from the snow, the trees, and the darkness itself. Suddenly, the nearest figure appeared at the ridge's edge, impossibly tall, face hidden in shadow. It raised its arm and pointed directly at us. The snow rippled again, and I realized this wasn't just a warning. It was marking us. I grabbed Claire, pulling her forward. "Run!" I shouted, though the sound seemed swallowed by the vast wilderness. The forest responded. Shadows stretched, snow warped, the hum intensified. We ran blindly, guided only by memory and the faint light of the ridge. Something unseen stalked us, calculating, patient, and relentless. The ridge led to a frozen river. We paused, gasping, unsure if it was safe to cross. The figures didn't follow immediately, but I could feel them watching, waiting. The hum had dropped to a low vibration, like the heartbeat of the wilderness itself. I scanned the horizon and saw movement across the ice. More shadows emerging from the forest. They didn't run. They glided, their bodies unnaturally straight, limbs too long. They positioned themselves along the riverbank, as though creating a barrier, hemming us in. Panic surged. Claire and I debated whether to turn back, but the forest behind us had swallowed the ridge. The shadows were patient, organized, deliberate. Any hesitation would be fatal. We moved quickly, testing the ice. The surface groaned, thick and brittle. Every step echoed unnaturally. The hum returned, pulsing faster, vibrating through our bones. It was as if the land itself was alive and hostile. Halfway across the river, a figure emerged from the center, taller than the rest, looming like a sentinel. Its eyes glowed faintly. It didn't chase us, but the pressure was unmistakable. It controlled every step, every heartbeat. We stumbled onto the far bank, collapsing in exhaustion. The shadows didn't follow immediately. They lingered at the edge, observing, waiting for the next opportunity. I realized then, this hunt wasn't over. We ran through the forest, desperate to find the ranger station. Every step seemed longer, as though the snow had grown heavier. Branches snagged clothing, yet the figures were always just behind, gliding over obstacles effortlessly. Then I noticed something terrifying. The snow under our feet occasionally rippled, forming patterns that mimicked the shapes of the figures. The ground itself was alive with their influence. Every instinct screamed to keep moving, but exhaustion and cold made our limbs feel like lead. Claire screamed suddenly, pointing ahead. I turned and saw a figure standing in a clearing, impossibly thin, arms raised. Behind it, the shadows formed a wall of darkness, stretching beyond the limits of the forest. They didn't advance. They didn't need to. The forest itself was a trap. I realized the truth. They weren't hunting us for food or even for sport. They were guardians of this frozen wilderness, punishing anyone who dared to intrude. The hum reached a crescendo, vibrating through the trees, snow, and air, merging with whispers that now formed words. Turn back. Leave now. Never return. But we had no choice. The ranger station was our only hope. With a trembling nod, we pressed forward, aware that any misstep could mean vanishing into this night forever. We finally saw the lights of the ranger station, faint through the trees. Relief surged, but the figures didn't disappear. They hovered at the edge of vision, just beyond reach, patient, almost bored now. Inside the station, we collapsed, shivering, gasping for warmth. The rangers stared in disbelief as we recounted the events. Footprints, shadows, whispers, the hum. They listened silently, exchanging worried glances. One finally spoke. You've seen them. Few do and live to tell the tale. They guard the wilderness. You've trespassed. Be thankful they only want a warning. I sat, numb, replaying everything in my mind. The footprints, the warped snow, the figures that glided without touching the ground. I realized the cabin itself had been a lure, a test. Even as I tried to convince myself it was over, I noticed a faint ripple of snow outside the window, as if the wind had a shape. The hum was almost imperceptible now, but I could feel it in my bones. A reminder that the wilderness had eyes, ears, and patience beyond our comprehension. I left the Yukon shortly after, vowing never to return. But the memory of those nights, the snow and the shadows, is etched into my mind forever. Years later, whenever winter comes, I still feel that hum in my chest. I dream of snow stretching endlessly, footprints appearing and vanishing, and the thin, elongated figures gliding silently just beyond reach. I've told this story to friends, colleagues, and even strangers, but few believe it. That doesn't matter. I know what I saw. I know what followed us. And I know the warning they left behind. The wilderness does not forgive. It does not forget. Sometimes, late at night, I catch a glimpse of a shadow in my peripheral vision. It doesn't move like a human, and it never leaves. I've learned not to look directly, not to provoke it. The Yukon is beautiful, breathtaking, and unforgiving. But beneath that beauty lies something ancient, patient, and endlessly watchful. Something that waits for travelers to stray too far, too late, into its frozen domain. We survived, barely. But I will never forget the cold, the hum, and the shadowed guardians that move through snow and darkness. If you ever hear the hum of the Yukon wind, listen carefully. it may be too late to turn back. My name is Thomas Reed, and this happened on a remote island off the coast of Newfoundland. I was a volunteer keeper at an old lighthouse, a job that promised solitude, salty air, and the kind of isolation that writers and dreamers crave. But what I didn't expect was how quickly the isolation would turn into something far darker. The first night was calm. Waves crashed against jagged rocks below, and the light from the lighthouse swept rhythmically across the sea. Yet, as I climbed to the top to check the lens, I noticed something unsettling. A figure standing on the cliff below, motionless, watching me. I squinted through my binoculars. No movement, no way down the rocks. Just a dark silhouette, staring upward, and then vanishing before I could blink. I told myself it was a trick of the fog, a shadow cast by the lighthouse beam. But a creeping unease settled in my chest. Every time the light rotated, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my vision. A figure standing just beyond the cliff, vanishing as soon as I looked directly. That night, the wind whispered through the lighthouse cracks. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded like breath. And I began to realize that someone, or something, was not only watching me, but waiting. My name is Claire Donovan, and this happened during a winter expedition in the Yukon. I had joined a small research team studying glacial patterns, and our base was an isolated cabin deep in the wilderness. The night air was crisp, the moonlight reflecting off endless sheets of snow, painting the landscape in silver and shadow. It was beautiful, terrifying, and absolute in its silence. The first night in the cabin felt normal enough. We lit the wood stove, shared a simple meal, and talked quietly about the expedition's plans. But around midnight, I noticed something odd. A single set of footprints led away from the cabin, out into the snow, disappearing into the trees. None of us had gone outside. I mentioned it casually to my colleague, Mark, who shrugged. Maybe an animal, he said. Could be a fox or coyote. But the prints were too deep, too deliberate. They weren't made by paws, they were human. Curiosity gnawed at me. I glanced out the frosted window, scanning the darkness. The footprints didn't return. They stopped abruptly as though the person had vanished. I should have let it go, gone back to bed. But something about those prints felt wrong, unnatural. That night, I couldn't sleep. Listening to the wind rattle the cabin and whisper through the trees as though carrying a secret meant only for me, I tried to ignore them, staying busy with lighthouse duties. But every rotation of the light brought my heart into my throat. The figures moved subtly, gliding along the cliff edges, appearing closer than they should, vanishing when I turned my head. I attempted to signal the mainland via radio, but the static drowned out my voice. No answer. The hum of the lighthouse machinery seemed to thrum in unison with my racing heartbeat. That night, I was jolted awake by scraping sounds against the lighthouse walls. Heavy, deliberate, as if claws were testing the structure. I looked out the window. The figures were no longer just on the cliffs. They were on the rocks below the lighthouse foundation, moving impossibly fast, climbing without effort. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and the light caught them momentarily. Their voids stared directly at me, unblinking, infinite. Then they disappeared again, leaving only silence and a whisper in the wind. You cannot leave. I realized with terror that isolation was no longer just physical. The lighthouse itself seemed to respond to them. Every creak, every vibration, every hum echoed their presence, reminding me that they were always close, always patient. I had survived solitude before, but never like this. I decided to document the phenomenon. I set up cameras around the lighthouse, hoping to capture evidence. The first few frames were normal: fog, waves, and jagged rocks. But as the night progressed, the footage began to show shapes. Figures appearing and disappearing instantly, moving in impossible patterns, sometimes inside the lighthouse itself, reflected only in mirrors or glass. Sleep was impossible. Every rotation of the lamp reminded me of the whispers. I began hearing voices in the machinery, low murmurs repeating my name, Thomas, echoing from the metal, from the glass, from the walls. I confronted the largest figure on the cliffs with a flashlight. Its eyes reflected nothing. A sense of ancient intelligence radiated from it, patient, observing. It raised an arm, slow, deliberate. The wind shifted, carrying with it a smell of brine and decay. The world seemed to bend slightly toward it, as if the air itself obeyed its command. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping, catching on the railing. When I looked back, it was gone. But I knew it hadn't moved. It was always there, just out of perception, shaping the environment in ways I couldn't understand. I realized the lighthouse wasn't protecting sailors. It was a beacon for them, a trap for the living. By the fifth night, exhaustion was unbearable. I hadn't eaten properly, and the wind and fog had taken a toll. Yet I couldn't leave the top of the lighthouse. Every instinct screamed that looking away or sleeping would be fatal. The figures were now more numerous, scattered across cliffs and jagged rocks, gliding with a silent rhythm. The voids of their eyes seemed to study every movement I made. When the beam passed, I glimpsed faces, impossibly elongated, frozen in unreadable expressions. I attempted to radio the mainland again. This time, a voice whispered my name back over the static. "Thomas, come down. Join us." I froze, heart pounding. My mind screamed for logic, but I felt an unnatural pull, a gravitational weight in my chest dragging me toward the cliffs. Something ancient, patient, and relentless was drawing me closer. I retreated to the interior, securing doors and windows. But the sensation didn't fade. The lighthouse itself seemed alive, trembling in response to their presence, every rotation of the lamp an announcement of my insignificance. I realized then I was no longer in charge of my own actions. I was being observed, studied, and perhaps even chosen. The figures waited. The following night, I resolved to keep watch from the interior, convinced that staying inside would offer safety. But the lighthouse itself seemed complicit with whatever haunted the cliffs. The metal groaned unnaturally, each hum in tune with the wind and the whispers that now echoed incessantly. Through the glass, I saw movement. Figures shifting along the cliff edge, gliding, bending in ways that defied physics. Some appeared closer than the rocks allowed, suspended in midair, their void-like eyes fixed on the lighthouse as if reading my very thoughts. I tried to retreat to my quarters, but the staircase felt endless. Shadows clung to every corner, elongated and alien, moving against the rotation of the lamp, dancing with an intelligence I couldn't comprehend. My flashlight flickered, then died. Darkness enveloped me. I felt the pull again, stronger this time, an invisible force urging me toward the top of the lighthouse. My hands shook as I climbed, heart hammering, every step echoing in the hollow shaft. At the top, the beam illuminated dozens of figures on the cliffs, standing impossibly still, watching, judging. And then I noticed the fog wasn't natural. It twisted around them, thick and almost viscous, like a liquid suspended in the air, shaping their forms and feeding their presence. I realized I wasn't just an observer. I was part of their world now, an intruder in a domain that would not let me leave unmarked. I tried to signal the mainland again, desperation overriding fear. The radio crackled, then a whisper. My name, drawn out and cold. Thomas, watch. The voice was neither male nor female. It resonated like the wind in a hollow cave. Below, the figures multiplied, emerging from the fog in impossible numbers. They didn't rush. They glided with a patience that made the hair on my neck stand on end. The lighthouse, my supposed sanctuary, felt like a cage. A sudden crash echoed from the foundation. Snow shifted unnaturally outside, forming patterns like symbols. The cliff edges trembled. I realized the ground itself obeyed them, bending reality to their will. I moved to the lens room to secure the light, hoping it would repel them. The moment I did, the wind shifted. A figure hovered just beneath the beam, its eyes like black holes, drawing light into them. It tilted its head slowly, as if acknowledging my defiance. The whisper came again, louder, more insistent. Stay or join. The weight in my chest intensified, a pressure I could not resist. My hands trembled on the railing, knowing that each rotation of the lamp was an invitation I could not ignore. I understood then. This wasn't a warning anymore. It was a choice. By the 8th night, my mind teetered on the edge of sanity. Sleep was impossible. The whispers invaded every corner of my thoughts. I tried to leave, descending the staircase, but the figures always waited at the windows, reflected in the glass, as if the walls themselves had become mirrors for their forms. I saw one emerge inside the lighthouse, a thin, elongated silhouette, gliding along the walls, its eyes voids of infinite depth. I stumbled back, heart racing. It didn't speak, but the weight of its gaze crushed me, filling my mind with cold visions of cliffs, fog, and the endless dark sea. I attempted to leave through the door, but the fog outside shifted violently, forming barriers taller than the cliffs themselves. The figures moved effortlessly across it, suspended as if the air itself was solid beneath their feet. The lamp rotated again, sweeping over them. I saw them clearly this time. Humanoid, impossibly thin, limbs elongated, heads tilting unnaturally. And yet, they were elegant, patient, almost serene. I realized the lighthouse didn't protect sailors. It maintained the balance between their world and ours. And now, I had crossed the boundary. They weren't hunting me for food or revenge. They were ensuring I understood the rules. Desperation clawed at me. I attempted to record everything with my camera, hoping to capture proof for the outside world. But every frame warped. The figures weren't captured fully. They blurred, stretched, folded into themselves. The fog seemed alive, consuming light and bending reality around them. I climbed to the top again, flashlight trembling. The air hummed, a low vibration in my chest. The figures below were motionless, but their presence pressed in, almost tangible. I could feel my heart beat in rhythm with their silent pulse. A voice whispered in my mind now. You cannot leave, yet you are watched. I realized the lighthouse was no longer a structure of stone and metal. It had become a bridge, a point where our world intersected with theirs. I had been chosen as an observer, a witness to something far older than humans, something patient and eternal. The night stretched endlessly. The fog thickened, curling around the cliffs and the lighthouse, embracing the beam. And I understood. I could never truly leave this place. I wasn't captured. Not yet. But the lighthouse had marked me, and I belonged to its watchers now. Years later, I still feel their presence. I left the lighthouse physically, but mentally, I am never free. Every foggy night, every wind that carries the smell of salt and cold, I hear whispers. Thomas, watch. I've tried to live a normal life, but the images haunt me. The elongated figures, the voids that reflect nothing, the fog that bends reality. I understand now that some places exist beyond human comprehension. Ancient sentinels maintaining boundaries we were never meant to cross. I have never returned to Newfoundland. But the lighthouse, the fog, and the watchers remain a part of me. I catch glimpses of them in mirrors, in shadows, in every stretch of darkness that touches my life. The island waits for new keepers, new witnesses. And when I see a lighthouse on a distant shore, the hum returns, a reminder that they are patient, relentless, eternal. If you ever hear whispers on a foggy night, remember my story. Some places are watched. Some lights are not meant to guide you, they are meant to warn. And the watchers never forget. My name is Daniel Hughes, and this happened during a solo camping trip in Algonquin Park, Ontario. I had always loved the solitude of the wilderness, the quiet, the isolation, the chance to escape city life. I rented a small cabin near the edge of a frozen lake, thinking it would be the perfect place to relax and write. The first night was uneventful. Snow fell softly outside, and the fireplace crackled with warmth. But as I sipped coffee and glanced out the window, I noticed footprints leading from the tree line to the cabin. They were fresh, human-sized, but there was no one outside. I shook my head, laughing at my own paranoia. It had to be another camper, maybe an early arrival or someone walking the trails. But unease settled into my chest, a cold pressure that didn't leave. Hours later, I heard scratching at the cabin door, light, deliberate, like claws dragging along wood. I froze, staring at the darkened trees. I called out, but no response came. When I finally mustered the courage to open the door, nothing was there, just snow and silence. Yet I felt a gaze on me, lingering, heavy, and unnatural. I realized that night that I wasn't entirely alone in Algonquin Park. Something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The following morning, I told myself it was imagination. Cabin life can play tricks on the mind when you're alone for hours, staring at endless snow. But the unease didn't leave. I went for a walk along the frozen lake, hoping to shake off the tension. The water was still, the ice solid, but something about the landscape felt off. Trees leaned unnaturally, shadows twisted across the snow in ways that didn't match the sunlight. Returning to the cabin, I noticed the footprints again. More of them, now forming a circle around the structure. They were not all human-sized. Some were smaller, others far too long, too narrow to belong to any human. By nightfall, the temperatures seemed to drop unnaturally fast. The fireplace barely heated the cabin. And then came the whispering, soft, distant at first, carried by the wind. I couldn't make out the words, only a sense of urgency, as if the forest itself were warning me. I tried to focus on writing, forcing my mind onto the blank pages, but I couldn't. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of snow outside made me flinch. And then I heard it, a single, deliberate knock at the window. Slow, patient, waiting. I approached the window slowly, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating snow and trees, but nothing else. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified. Hours passed. The wind howled through the treetops, carrying what sounded like faint, indistinct voices. They whispered my name, teasing, echoing in the cabin. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. Suddenly, the fireplace flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped the cabin, except for the flashlight beam. That's when I saw it. Just outside the window, a shadowy figure crouched among the trees. Not fully human, not fully animal, but something in between. Its eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, reflecting nothing but void. I stumbled backward. My heart raced. The figure vanished before I could react. Yet I could feel its gaze drilling into me, following every movement. I barricaded the door, shivering violently. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet I felt trapped, as if the forest itself had conspired to hold me here. The whispers grew louder, merging into words I almost understood. Stay, or you will join us. Sleep was impossible. Every sound, branches snapping, wind rustling, distant animal calls, felt amplified. I stayed awake, flashlight clutched tightly, listening. Suddenly, the cabin door rattled. Slow, deliberate. Someone or something was testing it. I froze, heart hammering, every instinct screaming to run. But I couldn't leave. The shadows outside seemed to stretch, curling around the tree line, watching, waiting. I noticed the footprints again. They weren't static. They had shifted, forming patterns that defied logic. Some led toward the trees, others returned to the cabin as if mocking me. I tried to call for help, but my phone had no signal. The radio emitted static, then faint whispers, repeating my name. I realized the forest itself had become a predator. The cabin wasn't safe. It was bait. The footprints, the whispers, the shadows. They were all part of a patient plan to draw me in, break me, make me part of the wilderness forever. That night, I stayed awake by the fire, listening to whispers grow louder, circling the cabin like an invisible predator. I knew that sleep meant surrender. By the fifth night, exhaustion was complete. My body ached, my mind teetered on the edge of collapse. But I couldn't stop watching. The shadows moved differently now, faster, more precise, as if they were testing me. I ventured briefly outside, flashlight trembling. The snow under my feet rippled unnaturally. I saw figures standing between the trees, motionless, their void-like eyes fixed on me. They didn't move toward me, yet the pull I felt was undeniable, an invisible leash guiding me back to the cabin. A sudden cold gust blew through, carrying whispers that were now clear. You should have stayed away. I stumbled back into the cabin, heart hammering, barricading windows and doors. The fireplace flickered again, and in the shadows, I saw movement. Figures emerging from the corners, tall, elongated, impossible. I realized that night. The cabin wasn't haunted by spirits. It was alive. The forest wasn't empty. It was full of watchers, patient, silent, eternal. And I had trespassed into their territory. The wind howled, carrying the faint echo of laughter, long, drawn out, impossibly cold. I had survived 4 nights, but I knew the 5th would determine if I could leave at all. Night 6 arrived, colder and darker than before. The snowstorm outside had intensified, and the wind shrieked through the trees like tortured souls. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a trap, walls creaking under the weight of unseen eyes. I sat near the fireplace, clutching a knife and my flashlight, trying to stay awake. Shadows moved outside, gliding closer with every rotation of my gaze. I thought I saw figures perched on the treetops, impossibly tall and thin, watching me silently. Then came a sound I couldn't ignore. A soft, deliberate scraping along the cabin's exterior. It circled the walls, moving against the rhythm of the storm. My heart raced, and I forced myself to peer out the window. Nothing. but the feeling of being studied intensified. Then, a faint shape emerged in the snow. Footprints leading from the woods, twisting unnaturally toward the cabin. They weren't all human. Some were long, narrow, and warped, like they didn't belong to our world. I realized with horror that the forest itself was alive, guiding them, bending reality to ensure I remained aware of their presence. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper was deliberate. I wasn't alone, and I wasn't safe. By the seventh night, exhaustion had begun to distort my perception. Every movement, every sound seemed amplified. The whispering voices outside grew coherent, repeating phrases I could almost understand. "Stay, join us." I tried to barricade the windows and doors tighter, but the shadows still moved against them. Something was testing me, probing for weakness. The snow outside shifted unnaturally, forming strange patterns and symbols around the cabin. Suddenly, the fireplace went out, leaving me in complete darkness. I scrambled for the flashlight, but the batteries flickered. In the faint beam, I saw movement inside the cabin itself. Thin, elongated figures slipping along the walls, their void-like eyes reflecting nothing, absorbing the light. I stumbled backward, heart hammering. The air felt heavier, each breath labored, as if the presence of these beings pressed upon my chest. I realized the cabin wasn't a refuge anymore. It was a stage, and I was the only performer. Then I heard a whisper clearly this time. "You cannot leave. The forest remembers you." I understood that the watchers weren't just outside. They were everywhere now, in the walls, in the shadows, in the very air I breathed. And they were patient, immensely patient. The eighth night brought a storm of wind and ice that rattled the cabin violently. Sleep was impossible, my mind fraying with each whisper and shadow. I could no longer tell where the figures were or if I was alone at all. At one point, I ventured to the porch, flashlight trembling in my hand. The forest outside had transformed, trees bending unnaturally, snow swirling in impossible patterns. Shapes emerged, tall, thin, gliding silhouettes that vanished the moment I focused on them. I noticed the footprints again, now encircling the cabin in a labyrinthine pattern. Some led to the forest, others returned inside, as if mocking my fear. The wind carried their whispers directly into my ears. "You belong to us." I retreated inside, slamming the door. The cabin itself seemed to pulse with their presence. The walls vibrated softly, the shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the darkness felt suffocating. I realized with certainty that I had trespassed into a domain I was never meant to enter. The forest was alive, patient, and eternal. And now, I was part of its story. Whether I survived or not would depend entirely on its will. Night 9. Exhaustion had set in, but fear kept me alert. The whispers were louder, more urgent. They seemed to echo from every corner of the cabin, bouncing off walls and merging with the wind. I tried to record evidence on my camera, but the footage distorted. The shadows elongated and folded in ways the lens could barely comprehend. The figures inside the cabin were visible only as fleeting silhouettes, disappearing when I looked directly at them. I climbed the staircase to the loft, my flashlight flickering. The air hummed with an unnatural vibration. I glimpsed the forest outside, dozens of elongated figures now standing silently, void-like eyes fixed on the cabin. Then, one figure emerged inside the cabin, gliding across the floor with impossible grace. I could feel its awareness pressing against me, probing my mind. I realized the watchers didn't need to touch me. Their presence alone controlled me, bending reality around me to enforce their domain. I understood fully then. This was a boundary I had crossed. I wasn't being hunted. I was being measured, observed, tested. And the watchers were infinite, patient, eternal. The 10th night was the most harrowing. I knew I could not escape, not through doors, windows, or even the forest. The whispers now filled the cabin completely, resonating in my mind, repeating my name over and over. Daniel. Stay. I sat near the fireplace, shivering, flashlight in hand. Shadows crawled along the walls, stretching impossibly, folding over themselves. The wind carried the echo of laughter, hollow and eternal. I understood then that the cabin, the forest, and the watchers were one entity. It wasn't alive in a traditional sense. It was patient, ancient, eternal, and it had claimed me as part of its story. I left Algonquin Park physically, but mentally, I never escaped. The whispers, shadows, and the sense of being observed followed me home. Every foggy night, every storm, every lonely forested path reminded me. Some places are alive, and some things are always watching. I survived, but I will never be free. And should you ever visit a remote cabin in Algonquin Park, remember my story. The forest is patient. It watches, and it waits for those who dare to enter its domain. My name is Caleb Turner, and I've lived in Northern Ontario long enough to believe I understood isolation. Winters here are quiet, too quiet sometimes. But after losing my father, I wanted that silence. I bought a small cabin near Lake Abitibi, thinking it would help me reset my life. The place had no neighbors for miles, only tall pines bending under snow. The first 3 nights were peaceful. I wrote in my journal, cooked simple meals, and watched snowfall thicken outside the windows. But on the 4th night, while making tea, I felt something off. That uncomfortable sensation of being watched. I shrugged it off as loneliness playing tricks on me. Yet when I walked past the front window, I caught a faint reflection of movement behind me. Someone standing outside. I froze. Slowly, I turned to face the window again. Nothing. Only darkness and drifting snow. But the uncomfortable truth settled in my spine like ice. Someone had been there, standing close enough to fog the glass, close enough to see inside. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the cabin felt heavier, louder, like the old wood was trying to warn me. By morning, I convinced myself it was a trick of light, maybe my own reflection. To clear my mind, I stepped outside and walked around the cabin. There were footprints, clear, human footprints circling the entire structure, pressed deep into the snow. My stomach tightened. Whoever had been here walked close to every window, one set of prints, slow, deliberate steps, like someone pacing, watching. I followed the trail into the woods, but after 20 feet, the prints simply stopped. No return trail, no direction, nothing but smooth, untouched snow, as if the person walked into the trees and vanished from existence. Back inside, I locked every door and nailed shut one of the loose windows. My rational mind tried to explain it. Maybe the wind filled the rest of the trail. Maybe the intruder doubled back somewhere I missed. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was someone out there, and they knew where I slept. That evening, the cabin felt smaller, the shadows longer. I kept the lights low and sat with my back to the wall, listening. My father used to call this predator silence, the type of quiet animals make when something bigger is hunting. Around midnight, as the wind pushed against the cabin, I heard soft crunching. Footsteps, slow, measured, approaching the back door. My breath hitched, The steps stopped. Then, gentle tapping on the window nearest my bed. 3 soft knocks, like someone using a single finger. I didn't move. Then came the whisper. A man's voice, low and hoarse, right through the wall. "Why'd you close the curtains?" My entire body went rigid. I hadn't told anyone I was here. No one knew except my sister, and she lived hours away. I didn't dare respond. The voice didn't speak again. Instead, I heard the footsteps circle, slow and steady, like he was dragging his boots through the snow. Then, silence. Not the peaceful kind, an intentional silence, like he was waiting for me to make a sound. At dawn, I found more footprints, fresh ones, pacing near my bedroom window, the print edges sharp and untouched by wind. I knew I had to leave the cabin, but my truck wouldn't start. The engine clicked weakly, refusing to turn over. I tried again. Nothing. Sabotage or coincidence. I grabbed my father's old hunting rifle, stepped outside and shouted into the trees, "Who's out there?" My voice disappeared into the forest, like it had been swallowed. I walked around the cabin again, gun raised. Behind the woodshed, something new caught my eye. A scarf, frozen, torn, and hanging from a branch. Dark red stains on the end. Next to it, in the snow, was a single glove. Not mine. It was like someone left them for me to find. Suddenly, branches snapped deeper in the woods. I raised the rifle, but whatever was out there moved quietly, too gracefully to track. Not running, circling, watching. A cold realization hit me. He wanted me scared. He wanted me to stay. And worst of all, he had done this before. That night was the worst yet. I barricaded the doors with furniture and kept the rifle close. Every light stayed off. Around 2 a.m., the tapping came again, this time at the kitchen window. Slow, steady, the taps became scrapes, nails dragging lightly along the glass. I whispered to myself, "Don't move, don't look, don't react." The scraping stopped. Then a soft exhale fogged the window from outside. I couldn't stop myself. I turned. A face was pressed against the glass, not fully visible. Just the outline of cheek, forehead, and one wide-open eye staring straight into the darkness of my kitchen. The eye didn't blink, didn't shift. It was like he was waiting for me to step closer. I dropped behind the counter, heart hammering so hard I felt dizzy. The face stayed there for nearly a full minute before slowly sliding downward, disappearing from view. But the worst part? He smiled before he left. I didn't see his mouth, but the skin around the eye crinkled in a way that unmistakably meant one thing. He was enjoying this. The next morning, I gathered supplies and prepared to trek 10 miles through the woods to the nearest highway. I stuffed food, water, and the rifle into a pack. Before leaving, I checked the perimeter one last time. That's when I found it. A small wooden carving sitting on my porch, crudely shaped, clearly hand-carved. It was a figure, me. Same jacket, same hat, even the little backpack carved on its back. Someone had watched me packing. A cold wave crawled up my spine. This wasn't random terror. This was obsession. I pocketed the carving and started down the trail, checking behind me every few minutes. For the first mile, nothing happened. Then, the feeling came back. Not footsteps, not sound. Just that primal instinct that something was matching my pace, staying just out of sight, following with patience. A branch snapped behind me. I spun, rifle raised. No one. But the woods felt wrong. Too still, too alert. Like the trees themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. I walked another hour, forcing myself to stay calm. Every so often, I saw small signs. Broken twigs, disturbed snow, a glimpse of dark fabric through trees. He was there, always just far enough not to be seen clearly, always shifting when I blinked or turned. By noon, snowfall thickened. Visibility dropped. I pushed forward, but the trail vanished under fresh snow. My compass spun erratically, something about the metal of the rifle, maybe. Or maybe I was panicking. I stopped to rest against a fallen log. That's when I heard breathing behind me. Slow, controlled, inches away. I didn't turn. I couldn't. For a long moment, I stayed frozen, every muscle locked. Then the breathing shifted, moving around me, circling, teasing. Suddenly, a voice whispered from the trees, "Keep going. I want to see how far you get." I bolted. Branches whipped against my face as I ran blindly through the storm. The voice didn't chase me. He just laughed, soft, almost delighted. That was somehow worse than if he had run at me. He wasn't hunting me out of rage. He was playing. I stumbled into a clearing around 3 p.m. and collapsed beside a half-frozen stream. My breath came in painful bursts, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the rifle. Snow whispered down around me, soft, peaceful, mocking. I checked behind me. No figure, no movement. For a moment, hope sparked. Maybe I'd outrun him. Maybe he'd gotten bored. But then I noticed something across the stream. A tree trunk marked with 20 or 30 deep scratches, carved in long vertical lines. And at the bottom, barely visible under ice, a strip of fabric caught on bark. My jacket's color. I hadn't walked near that tree, which meant he had taken something from me earlier and left this mark as a message. Another gust of wind carried a voice across the clearing, distant, echoing, impossible to locate. "You're close now." Close to what? The road? Safety? Or exactly where he wanted me? The storm grew worse as daylight faded. I forced myself to keep moving, though my legs felt like lead. Every sound became distorted in the wind. Whispers, footsteps, laughter. As I neared a ridge, I saw something ahead that made my heart plummet. My cabin. Not the road, not the highway. My cabin. I had walked in a massive circle. There was no way I made that mistake on my own. Someone led me back. As I stood there, stunned, a figure stepped out from behind the cabin. Tall, bundled in dark winter gear, face hidden behind a hood. He didn't approach. He simply raised his hand and pointed at my bedroom window, the same one he'd watched me from. Then he tilted his head, slowly, as if asking me whether I understood now. I didn't speak, didn't move. And then, without warning, he stepped backward into the tree line and vanished like smoke and wind. I didn't go back inside. I ran past the cabin, straight toward the lake, and followed the shoreline until sunrise. Hours later, half frozen, I found a ranger station where 2 officers wrapped me in blankets and listened as I stuttered through the night's events. They searched the cabin. They found footprints, hundreds of them. Some were fresh, some were old. Some were so close to the windows that the glass still showed the faintest outline of breath. But they never found the man. Not the scarf, not the carving, nothing. As if he erased every trace after I fled. I sold the cabin the next week and moved far from northern Ontario. Sometimes, late at night, I feel that same cold sense of being watched. And every time I walk past a window, I check the glass for fog or the outline of a face. Because the officer told me something before I left. This wasn't the first report like yours, and none of the others ended with the person getting away. I don't know if he'll ever come after me again. But I know one thing, he's still out there, and he knows I survived.